when her death was advertised at first, they were trying to frame it as if it had been a murder, that as they were like investigating foul play. But, when her body was found, in that first poem it mentions, there was a cinder block that had been tied to her. It was very much intentional, but a lot of the publications, they wanted to take any route possible other than explaining the truth that it was suicide, so I'm sure that carries through as well.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation, in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities. What is a Mr. Microphone?
You're too young to remember the Mr. Microphone, aren't you?
Yeah.
Ethan Shanty
Didn't
is
you
with
hear
us.
my tone? Of course I'm too young to remember.
Ethan's our producer, and he joins us before our interview conversations on Northwards. And we're going to hear from the poet Sophie Morelli in a little while. But Ethan's wondering about what a Mr. Microphone is.
Yeah. I think everyone else is too.
back in the 80s, might have been a Ronco device. I'm not sure. I think it was a Ronco device.
Oh, like the set it and forget it and the pocket fisherman?
Yes, exactly. Like Ron Popeil.
Yeah, I used to watch a lot of his infomercials at night because I've always been a night owl. And after about 2 a.m., there wasn't anything good on television except Ron Popeil. I don't know if that was good, but anyway.
So Mr. Microphone was a device. It was a microphone, actually, for the budding broadcaster in all of us.
Really?
And the idea was it had this really tiny, very low-powered transmitter in it that broadcast to a certain frequency on FM, I believe. And so the novelty was you could have this microphone.
Okay.
And you could turn on the radio in your house.
Oh, okay.
And you could talk into the microphone and be heard on the radio.
Oh, much like the mechanism that drive-in movie theaters use now.
Yeah, very much like that. And the commercial for this showed the many exciting uses for the Mr. Microphone, including these two guys. They're in the convertible, and the young ladies are carrying a radio. So they're broadcasting as they drive along in this convertible, and one of them goes, "Hey, good looking, we'll be back to pick you up on the way home."
The real-world implications of this product would disturb people.
And that's why I got into radio.
If you just started randomly broadcasting into a person's vehicle who's sitting next to you, you would terrify them.
Right. Well, especially because, what are the chances that they have their radio tuned to whatever frequency?
That exact frequency,
Mr.
yeah.
It was.
So it's not really practical. It's just a novelty.
It was technologically indefensible.
You're texting. Am I boring you?
No, I'm looking at Mr. Microphone.
Oh, okay. I take that
to see
back.
if it was in fact Ron Popeil. Yes, Mr. Microphone by Ronco.
What's my favorite infomercial? Yeah, I really like the Flowbee. I'm a big fan of the Flowbee. Let's talk about something else. Today's interview is with Sophie Morelli, who is a poet.
She is a poet. She grew up in Lake Placid, and she wrote a collection of poems about Mabel Smith Douglass, who we'll get to talking about here in a few minutes. But the book is called Fathom, but it's not a book. And I'm familiar with poetry enough to know that these things are called chapbooks.
Right.
They're little books. They're little books you can fit in your back pocket. But I do not know, and maybe you know because you are indeed a poet yourself, Ethan.
Right.
Why is it called a chapbook?
So I never knew, despite having written 2 chapbooks myself, one when I was like 22 and one a couple last year.
If you haven't written your first chapbook by 22, just give it up.
It's never going to happen for you. No, that's not true at all. But yeah, despite having written 2 myself, I never really understood why it was called that. I kind of thought maybe in the back of my brain that it was like representing like a single chapter of a book, because the collection tends to be between like 20 and 40 pages. But I went to Wikipedia, always reliable, more reliable than Google AI, and it says chapbook is hold on.
Does it give you a pronouncer for chapbook?
Seemingly, according to Wikipedia, 1824 seemingly derives from chapman, the word for the itinerant salesman who would sell such books. The first element of chapman comes in turn from Old English barter business dealing, from which the modern adjective cheap was ultimately derived. So I guess that's still.
So it's a cheap book of poetry.
I think that still stands. Yeah, most chap books are like $10, which is pretty cheap. Anyway, now we know.
Well, and to be really meta, maybe as the resident poet on Northwards, you should write a chap book about Chapman.
I'm living my life as a chapman. I am a person who goes from town to town, selling my
poetry salesman,
selling my cheap wares. Lots of really bad pots and pans. As
kind
well
of brings us back
poetry.
to the infomercial thing, doesn't it?
It kind of does. The Floby by NCPR.
Sophie Morelli, do you want to talk about poetry first?
I guess we can.
We can talk about poetry after.
Does anybody like poetry? I like poetry a lot.
You didn't always like poetry.
No,
though.
I did not. I went to school really anticipating that my focus would be in fiction. I really wanted to write novels. You get there by writing short stories first, and then you build your way up. I took most of my writing classes with Dr. Maurice Kenny, who was a Pulitzer Prize-nominated poet and the writer-in-residence at SUNY Potsdam while I was there. And so I started taking classes with him and was having a lot of fun writing fiction under his tutelage. And then as I was about to graduate, he himself was getting ready to retire. He was in his 70s at that point, and he was pretty ready to move back to Saranac Lake and just devote the rest of his life to writing. So he told me, hey, I'm teaching my final course in poetry and you are going to take it. And I said, no, I'm not. And he said, you don't understand. You are taking it. And I really protested a lot because, like every 14-year-old, I had written poetry and thought that it was like really deep. But then as I, got a little bit older and I looked back at it, I realized like I didn't really have anything to say and I wasn't very good at it. I was worried, honestly, about being vulnerable because that's what poetry is. Mm-hmm. You're just kind of laying bare the, like, if you'll excuse me, like the essence of your soul. And and that's how you connect with people, and that's how you connect with yourself. And so I was really, really nervous about that. I didn't think that I could do it, and I wanted to focus my creative energies on like fictional people. But then once I got into the course, I realized that it was super beneficial for me, and I liked it. Moreover, like, I don't know that I was good at it out of the gate, but he certainly saw something in me. What I found is that even if I wasn't going to continue on as a poet, it helped me in my fiction and it helped me in my essay writing and my nonfiction, because the thing that you learn in your poetry workshops is that you need to be brief. In poetry, less is more, and I think that if you learn that lesson well, it translates very effectively to your other kinds of writing. And I, as a professional writer or editor. Am I a professional writer? I don't know. I do a lot of writing for work. I'm always finding that I'm slashing words and doing my best to say as much as possible with as few words. And I took a really long time to get here to say that. But I don't really talk about poetry. I talk about the craft of poetry in like workshops and stuff, but I don't really talk about it with people who don't write it. Does that make sense? Because you don't really write poetry.
I don't write poetry at all.
And so it's hard for me to like kind of describe why I love it. But anyway.
And to this day, I mean, I regret, really going into the beginning of my senior year of college, I had a double major in politics and English.
Oh, okay.
And there were two classes that I had to take to complete my English major. One was a class on the writing of Marcel Proust, and the other was a poetry class. And I didn't want to take either of those. And by then I was going into my fifth year of college.
Was the poetry class composition or study? Just reading?
I don't even remember.
Oh, okay.
It's been some time.
Okay, yeah, a little while.
Like 33 years ago.
What reason didn't?
I honestly, I don't think I thought I was deep enough to appreciate poetry.
Oh,
I think
you don't still feel that way.
No, I actually very much appreciate poetry now. I don't actively seek it out a lot. But I am always amazed at when I do have cause to spend some time with poetry, as in the case of this book by Sophie Morelli. This chapbook by Sophie Morelli, how much I enjoy it and how much I enjoy the opportunity to kind of tuck into what the poet is trying to say. I can go either way on the question of whether song lyrics constitute poetry, but
Maurice Kenny would say no, but
you can't get around the idea that they have a lot in common
for sure.
anyway. And I think I enjoy a good poem for the same reason I enjoy a very lyrical song, and that is the ability for language to maybe, I don't know, obliquely tell a story. You know, I like a good straightforward song too, but sometimes like the use of language to convey the emotion that the writer is feeling or trying to get across is what I appreciate about the song lyric or the poem. And I recognize that that's a pretty shallow way of describing it, but
no, I don't think so at all.
So all that is to say that I very much enjoyed the opportunity to read Sophie Morelli's chapbook called Fathom, which is about Mabel Smith Douglass, who people may know as the lady in the lake who drowned in
Lake
Mirror
Placid.
Lake in Lake Placid.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more to the book than just that. And it's not even a legend. It really happened.
But it has become a legend.
Right. It's taken on mythological status.
Right. And because it's kind of become, as Sophie will tell you, it's kind of unfortunately become like a tourist attraction. And that's because, as you'll hear Sophie talk about, the really dirty, grimy details of this woman's untimely passing have been distilled into like the simplest bits so that people, when they're coming to visit, don't really have to grapple with the reality of it. And I didn't really know too much about this before hearing the interview with Sophie. And it was really enlightening and made me think about like what other kind of like, ghost stories are rooted in reality and real people and whose legacy is kind of being
co-opted.
Co-opted, yeah, that's exactly the right word. Co-opted for like tourist dollars, which is not to throw shade on any of these towns or organizations or whatever that are giving people like walking tours and ghost tours and stuff like that, because it is really interesting. But I think sometimes you do run the risk of stripping that person of their humanity.
Right. Right, and the story of Mabel Smith Douglass is like truly tragic, surrounding her and her family, and we'll hear more about it as Sophie Morelli explains. I should mention that we did this interview originally as part of a series that I host for the Adirondack Experience, the museum at Blue Mountain Lake, called In the Adirondack Library. And so this conversation is excerpted from a longer conversation that includes some questions from other people who are watching our interview. And if you want to see that, we'll have a link at ncpr.org/northwards.
Before we get to the interview, why don't we hear one of her poems and then we'll go to the chat.
Usually the fun thing about reading poetry is there's some fun noise or fun snapping in between, but I'll pretend that you're all snapping and I'll pretend that there's wild snapping going on. The next poem I'm gonna read for you, I guess warning if you're a little bit queasy, but something that I learned about in the process of learning about Mabel Smith Douglass and her story is that when they found her body, she was perfectly preserved at the bottom of the lake. And that's due to something called saponification. It's essentially when organic matter is preserved in a natural environment in such a way that it kind of turns to soap. So that is what happened to Mabel. She was perfectly preserved. And then when the divers found her and brought her to the surface, her environment changed in such a way that she ended up kind of dissolving and just scattering due to them bringing her to the surface. So this poem is about that. Saponification is the process that occurs after death, in which fat from the body transforms into adipocere, gray and wax. Adipocere is like the scrubbing clean of a wound, of a face. Saponification is how two men looking for lake trash find a mannequin in the depths. How they actually find a woman. Her eyes closed 10 minutes ago. Last night, maybe. Saponification is the lack of doubt of identity. What we are not saying is that the men destroyed her by bringing her closer to us. The woman was her face still, was her dress and hair and perfect eyelids. And then, as if to giggle, as if in frigid irony, she was dust. She was one, and then she was 1 billion. Pieces of her under the diver's nails. A diver wakes up in the night swearing he can feel her in his lungs, swearing he can hear her laugh.
That is Sophie Morelli reading from her collection of poems called Fathom. And I had a chance, as I mentioned, to chat with Sophie about this collection and about her work. She explains a little bit more about the life and times of Mabel Smith Douglass.
She was an incredibly accomplished woman. She was a dean at Rutgers. She did a lot of really important work in education. But as you said, yeah, her life was really entrenched in this tragedy, and it continued even after she passed away. So what I learned through research was that she lost her husband to a heart attack. She lost her teenage son to suicide. She then, of course, died. She passed away as well. And then her daughter died of suicide as well. So it's really, it's this story that kind of the more I learned about her and the more adversity I learned about her life. She had a lot of mental health struggles that she dealt with, and she actually sought help. She was institutionalized herself, like she went somewhere to get help, and the institution treated her very poorly. And in that time, so we're in the 1930s, mental health is extremely taboo. It's extremely taboo for women. Women who sought help like this are often treated very badly. It's immediate hysteria. They're often like locked up. It just wasn't a helpful place to seek help. So it was something very challenging, but she tried to seek help anyway. That was something that was really shocking to me, was learning that it wasn't just this isolated incident of what happened to Mabel, but it was really, it was her whole family, kind of, that it was almost like a curse. Yeah.
When or maybe why did you start thinking more deeply about the circumstances around Mabel and start doing this research?
The idea for the project as a whole, once I was out of school and I wanted to start taking writing more seriously, I just was in this phase. I was always only ever writing love poems. Oh my God. And I thought, I just have to be able, I have to be capable of something more than just like writing about mediocre men I know. Like there has to be more. So I really saw out. I was like, okay, I really want to work on my craft. I don't want to just be writing about what I'm feeling at the time. I want to do work that feels, not to bash people who write love poems. I love a love poem, right? But I felt like I wanted more for myself. And I read, when I was in grad school, I read a poetry book called Lucy by Jean Valentine. And it's about Lucy, the 3 million-year-old skeleton, the first upright hominid. And it was a whole book of poetry about Lucy. And I thought that was incredible. I'd never seen anything like that in poetry before. And so I sought out to think of something that I could give that level of attention to and research and really form an entire project around. And so eventually when I was, thinking through ideas, I must have seen something must have flagged me to it. But I thought this story that I had heard when I was a child and I really didn't know anything about, I thought that would be perfect. And it was, because there was so much more to the story than what we're told in my town.
Well, this is maybe the wrong metaphor to use, but I'm going to use it anyway. How close to the surface in Lake Placid growing up is the story of Mabel?
The story is kind of everywhere, and there's what I mentioned in the foreword of the book. I remember being a kid in fourth grade, and we were taken on a tour boat on Lake Placid, and the boat, I believe, was called The Lady in the Lake. And they took this class of fourth graders out to Pulpit, and they told us the story, like a class of little fourth graders, which maybe is too young for that kind of, but I don't know. So that was the first time I remember really hearing about it. And the thing that sticks out to me now is that when they were telling us the story when I was young, they didn't even say her name. She's only ever known as the Lady in the Lake. Like she's known as the ghost who haunts Pulpit Rock. And you'll see that's the image on the cover of the book as well, is that now like we would go and we would jump off of Pulpit for fun. That's an activity, a thing that people go and do. So she's kind of more of, it feels like some carnival attraction. It's a story that gets tourists interested and gets like people interested, but there's really so much more to it once you dig a little bit.
Well, and once you dig a little bit, thinking about it in those terms makes it feel like the general atmosphere around her is kind of exploitative.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons I thought kind of a different perspective was so important. There is another book that exists about the Lady in the Lake, but it's very well known, but it's very clinical. It's mostly about what happened, the process of finding the body, what happened, the autopsy. It's very clinical, it's very fact-based, which serves its purpose. But again, predominantly in the book, she's referred to the Lady in the Lake or the body. Her name is like very rarely mentioned. So through this whole, and that book I believe came out in the 80s. So again, different time. But yeah, her whole history since her passing has kind of been more of a spectacle, more of an attraction, something to kind of be ogled at and then forgotten. So I thought it would be valuable to have a different perspective out there.
Yeah,
It's a
I
little more,
wonder if not using her name, keeping her at that kind of arm's length makes it work better as a ghost story. And once you start thinking about the actual person and the tragedy around it, it loses its ability to scare fourth graders at that level and just makes people sad.
yeah, I agree. It's definitely, yeah, yeah, because if they went too far into her story, it's not fun anymore. It's tragic. It's a bummer. Mental health, talking about mental health in her time, in the time that, any other publications have come out about her, it was extremely taboo to talk about to the point where when her death was advertised at first, they were trying to frame it as if it had been a murder, that as they were like investigating foul play. But, when her body was found in that first poem it mentions, there was a cinder block that had been tied to her. It was very much intentional, but a lot of the publications, they wanted to take any route possible other than explaining the truth that it was suicide. So I'm sure that carries through as well.
Well, and there was one of the poems that you write really got me thinking about it in different terms, like the notion that drowning in a lake is a much different scenario than drowning in the ocean. There are many more conscious decisions that go into to killing yourself by trying to drown yourself in a lake versus, someplace where there are waves and tides and undertow.
Yeah, exactly. And I was thinking about that a lot while I was writing it. A lot of the book was written, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, at Twitchell Pond. So I was on a body of water, on a camp on a body of water, and I would go out on the dock and I would be writing, and the water would be so still. It's like glass out there. And it really made me think, like, yeah, of course, you would really have to have an intention here because everything is so calm, it's so still. You would really have to be the disruptor in that situation. It's not like the ocean where you can get pulled under. There's not an undertow. There's not anything vicious in Lake Placid as far as I know of. There's not any alligators in there. So yeah, it makes you real, even being near a lake or a body of water like that makes you realize like it really had to have it was intentional. There's no other way. Yeah.
Well, so let's talk about this time out at the pond and at this camp because it was part of your I mean it was your writer's residency, the La Bastille residency. Why was it so important for you to apply to be a part of it and go through the whole process?
I don't think I could have engineered a better place to write this specific book. So the Anne LaBastille residency, which is put on by the Adirondack Center for Writing in Saranac Lake, it takes place, you go out to a great camp, Anne LaBastille's camp on Twitchell Pond, and it is in the true middle of nowhere. You're driving at a certain point, your cell service drops off, your internet drops off. There's some Wi-Fi at the camp, so I could research, but you're really pretty cut off. Even the neighbors are pretty far off. So, but I was in the wilderness and of course a beautiful camp, we're not roughing it out there by any means, but you're out in nature. And again, I was on this body of water and I would, go out and sit on the water and it just felt like a parallel to where Mabel was, the day that she passed away. And it was autumn, so like The leaves were different every single day. The foliage was changing. I was just really like immersed in the Adirondacks, and that I think made me have the ideas like we were just talking about with the lake versus the ocean. Like being out in that environment really facilitated the writing of a lot of these poems because I felt like I was in the same environment that Mabel was in when she died.
And you're out there for how long?
2 weeks.
2 weeks, it's a lot of time, and at the same time, it's not a lot of time. How do you deal with the pressure of having to make sure the muse is present while you're there? I mean, it's one thing to have the setting be right, but it's another thing to feel like writing a poem.
I think it was just the fact that we had, I mean, you get there and this it sounds like a dream and it is eventually, but you get out there and you realize I have 2 weeks and my only responsibility for every hour of every day is to write. You have 10 hours of daylight stretching out and your only responsibility is to make something. So it was me and five other there's six of us, six residents, and that was so terrifying at first. We were all so freaked out, but you settle in and you find the system that works for you, and then it is a dream because you get to focus on everything I wrote out there felt so intentional because I had the time to write it and go back to it and go back to it and build on it. There was a quote that one of the other poet resident kept saying, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but he was saying, you can't guarantee you're going to be struck by lightning, but you can go and stand in a field with a metal pole and it helps. So we were just the fact that you could be there sitting at a desk or like sitting on the dock, sitting outside, sitting with a pen in your hand for that amount of time. I didn't need to wait for a mediocre man to do something dumb so I could write a poem. I had the material and I had the time, which was incredible. This project feels really precious because it's not about me. It's taking somebody else's life, and making something out of it. So I think having that amount of time, although it spooked us a little bit at first, definitely once I, kind of found the rhythm, it was so valuable. I think when you give yourself the time to write, not that everyone, is extreme privilege to have that amount of time to sit and write, but if you give yourself any amount of time consistently, I think it's really incredible what you can make or what can come out of that.
I imagine at some level when you first get there, there's a fear that it's going to be Jack Nicholson in The Shining, and you're going to be looking at this blank page and writing all work and no play makes Sophie a dull girl.
Yeah, definitely. No, and that was the fear because you say a thing that writers do is that, oh, I'll get to it. When I have more time, I will work on that novel. I will do that project. But then what happens when you have the time? Freaks you right out. But that's what was great about having all of this space, but also a small community of writers as well, is that everyone had their own process. And some people were already really, really tight into what they liked in a writing process. So, one person would be really writing manically at his keyboard for 7 hours of the day, and another girl would say, I'm going for a 3 hour walk, and then I will come back and I will write. And another one wrote really late into the night and like slept really late. And so, like, just everyone had their own process. So, seeing that and giving myself the permission to kind of figure it out for myself, that helped me also carry a better writing process into my life after the residency was over too.
And so in that continuum of one person sitting at their keyboard for 7 hours and one person going for a 3 hour walk and writing when they got back, where were you on this continuum? What was your process like while you were there?
I was a pretty early riser there, so I was lucky to wake up before a lot of people, not before everyone, but I would go out. Like I said, there was a dock off the camp that went out onto the water. So I would first thing in the morning go out and I would just sit on that dock and I would just watch the mist come off the water. You could hear loons. It was, if I could do it every year, like I wish I could bottle it. Like it was just amazing. So I would go out there and I would spend the morning writing. I would just kind of brain dump and like sort through things right for the morning. And then I would spend some time either reading or listening to audiobooks, just like consuming other people's work. I found that that helped me balance it out. What I was researching was very morbid and very dark, so I needed to kind of get out of that funk at some point during the day. I listened to a lot of David Sedaris audiobooks while I was on residency, which was a great balance. And then in the later part of the day, I would do research. So I would look up more about her life, her family, if there were any current ties, anything like that. And then that gave me a lot of fodder for the next writing session. And we also shared our writing every day too, which was really helpful. It helped us work out anything that we were having issues with too.
Let me ask you a little bit about craft, because the work of a poet can sometimes seem pretty mysterious. You know, we might all have this image in our head of the poet who, scribbles down a few lines and crumples them up and throws them in the fire, and a lot of self-loathing going on. Apparently, a lot of mediocre men. But how, when you start to write something, how do you decide the form a particular work is going to take? What's right for an erasure poem versus what's right for iambic pentameter versus what's right for, any number of other forms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think sometimes, especially for this book, when I was focused on one subject, and there was a lot of research, so this one did provide some great material for things like erasure poems, and I think that helps connect the story to what you're making. So I think sometimes I did set out with a particular form in mind. There were some things I read while I was on residency that there were new forms I wanted to try. There was, new layout, maybe experiment with some different things. But I think a lot of the time you have to kind of find it as you write it. A lot of my poems, at least at first, are just a block of text. It's just a wall of, words or vaguely talking about some idea. And then I think you get to kind of chisel away at it until it's something that makes sense. So I think it's more common for that to happen. It was really fun and it was an exciting challenge to try and play with form because I knew I needed to do something different in these poems. I couldn't have everything be kind of the same form because it was all in the same subject. I needed to find different ways to introduce what I was talking about. The hardest thing for me that I find is finding my way into the poem. So starting, a lot of the time I'll have 10 lines that actually are not really needed, but you need to have them there at first so you can work through it and find, where the meat is. The form is more of an experiment, but a lot of the time the poem will tell you, I think, which sounds very woo-woo, but I think it does. I think it finds its way kind of.
What was it like to grow up as a budding poet in Lake Placid?
I mean, I always knew from a young age that I wanted to be a writer. It was kind of the only thing that I knew I wanted to be. Actually, I did want to be, the guys, when you go to the grocery store and the guy picks out your lobster and he gives you the lobster. That's what I wanted to be first. And then I wanted to be a writer. Those were the two things that I knew. But I didn't know, even late into high school, what's the avenue to being a writer? How do I do that? I didn't really know the way in. But I was exposed to a lot of writing and poetry through classes I took in high school. I was assigned like a poetry project in high school, and through that, I found these videos of spoken word poetry, and I was like, "Oh, this is it. Like this is how I do it." And actually, we were talking about Paul Smith's before, but there's a writing retreat kind of that happens for high school kids at Paul Smith's every year, where the Adirondack Center for Writing brings in these amazing spoken word poets and you write with them for a couple of days and they teach you how to, write in different forms and they perform for you and then you get to perform. And because of that, like in programs like that, so really I owe a lot of my writing career to the Adirondack Center for writing. So if you're not checking them out, you should be. But this, like, the small town gave me the opportunity to do all of these different things. And I think I was in a really great area where there were like poetry contests and like things where that was nurtured. I was learning a lot and I was also getting to practice. Once I found a thing that I really loved, there were a lot of places for me to try it out. There was a lot to learn. There were people who wanted to help me. My mom was the librarian at Lake Placid for many years, and she, you know, fueled my excessive reading habits, So I felt once I found something that I could really like sink my teeth into, I felt like that was really nurtured. I felt like it was something that was supported, and that was one of the reasons I love living in a small town. Once people know that thing about you, people were saying, here's where you could submit a poem. Like, will you write a poem for this? So even though I was in my very early stages and everything was very rusty and I didn't have the hang of it yet, I didn't care because I was just writing all the time and I had people who were encouraging me to write all the time.
And that's pretty remarkable because I've noticed, certainly, and I think a lot of people notice, as you get older, the self-editing gene starts kicking in, and you think, well, I could do this, but it won't be any good. And it sounds like you got into it at just the right time where I'm not saying you should have been a self-editor, but you didn't feel constrained by your own standards or expectations or whatever.
Yeah, when I started writing poems and I was binge watching spoken word videos, I started writing. I was like, I am so good at this. I nailing it. Nailing it. And like, of course, when I look back on stuff now, oh, like I want to just crawl out of my skin. I was so obsessed with it that it makes me happy to think about because I had finally found a way into writing that I felt like I was just killing it. I loved it. I found something in it. Like I have, written other things since, but it's always like since I found that it's been like poetry all the way through. I like playing with other things and I love to read everything. But when I found poetry and found like different ways that people were exploring poetry, that was it. And yeah, definitely had a little bit of a teenage god complex once I started. So I was like, oh, nailing it. I'm gonna be in button poetry next. Like that's me, that's me up there. So that yeah, the self-editing gene didn't maybe kick in until I was in college and kind of surrounded by a lot of other writers and people who took writing very seriously, the Stephen King rejection letters stapled to the wall kind of thing. I was like, oh, so there might actually be, some rejection involved here. Actually, I need to take myself down a peg. But yeah, when I started, I was obsessed and thought I was just the greatest. So yeah, it was a good place to start before I kind of mellowed out a little bit. Yeah.
Full disclosure, I wrote a hard-boiled detective novel when I was a sophomore in high school that I thought was amazing. And now I realize how badly I was treating the English language and should have been punished for it.
Such a great feeling though to feel like you have the next great thing. Like I make that. Yeah.
How much of this project did you actually get done in the residency?
Most of it. I mean, I pitched the project on my application for the residency. That was what I wanted to do, but I think I had maybe just 4 or 5 poems done at that point, if that. And those were, of course, reworked a lot. But I don't know where in the process this book would be if it was not for that residency. I mean, really, I'm sure I talked. The facilitators were Tyler Barton and Natalie Thill at Adirondack Center for Writing when I went, and I'm sure I just talked their ear off about it because I don't know where it would be if it was not for that residency because the book was really written there. And, of course, 2 weeks it doesn't seem like a long time for a project like that to be completed, but it's all day, every day. It's a lot of reworking. And it was, worked over after, of course, but the bulk of the project was completed there, definitely.
Sophie Morelli's chapbook of poems is called Fathom. She grew up in Lake Placid, and she talked to me as part of the In the Adirondack Library series for the Adirondack Experience Museum at Blue Mountain Lake. Ethan Shanty back in the studio with us.
Hello.
And I think you were working on some poems while we were listening to that, weren't you?
I was, and just like Sophie's, they are a barrel of fun. You know what's really funny is that a couple weeks ago, I think that I tend to write these like pretty bleak poems, and a lot of them are, rooted in like grappling with my dad's death and like family identity and my place in the world and stuff. And I wrote this poem like a couple weeks ago that was, Sophie talked about writing love poems about like random men and how she wanted to get away with that.
It was mediocre men.
Mediocre
Yes.
men, that's right. Yeah, not random men, mediocre men, of which I am one.
Aren't we all?
We all are. But many, many years ago, I was down visiting my mentor Maurice Kenny with my girlfriend Erin, who's still my girlfriend, and he was like chastising me for not writing any love poems for her. And so I really I didn't take offense to that. I took it to heart, and I realized I probably should write more love poems about this person who I'm dedicated to. But I just like don't think that I'm very good at it. I'm not the best at like expressing myself that way. Sometimes I do it. I think I've written like a couple of good love poems, but otherwise I'm writing all of these poems about like death and darkness and, as I said, very fun stuff. And then, so I brought this poem to my writing workshop, and at the end of it, my friend Kayla was like, I know this poem is about death, but I think it's actually a love poem. And more than that, I think all of your poems are actually love poems. And it really upset me. Not because I don't want to be writing those poems, but because it forced me to like recontextualize like all of the work that I've been doing, which I thought was like about this one thing, like grappling with like loss and stuff. But then realizing that, oh, maybe the reason I'm doing that is because that's the way I express love to people, my friends and family. And it kind of rocked my world.
And that is why I did not become a poet. When I want to write about baseball, by golly, I write about baseball.
I'm not couching it in metaphor, damn it.
Also taking us out of the realm of metaphor, how about the closing credits?
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, produced, and edited by Mitch Tyke with digital production supervision by me. I'm Ethan Shanty. To find out more about this program, listen to past conversations, and to support Northwards, head to ncpr.org/northwards. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.
Ethan, I think those closing credits are actually a love poem.